This is episode 86 of That Shakespeare Life. This episode is brought to you in part by Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation App, the only audio Shakespeare pronunciation app which is designed to remove fears about how to speak Shakespeare's language so that his plays are accessible to everyone. Find out more about this app in today's show notes and stay tuned after the episode for how you can learn more.
Hi, I'm Dr. Ian DeYoung, scholar of the book and theater history in pre-modern Europe. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
He then inherited that and he used it for personal entries. So he records like recipes for healing diseases and, loans, personal loans involving him buying of properties. He also has pawn accounts in there because Henslowe worked as a pawnbroker. And then the majority of the entries, yes, relate to theatrical matters, predominantly for the theatres in which he was invested, the Rose and then later the Fortune.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Elizabethan England, much of what we know about how theaters were operated comes from the diary of a man who ran dozens of them during Shakespeare's lifetime, Philip Henslowe. Henslowe was enterprising and ambitious, setting up the Bear Garden for bear baiting and establishing the Rose, the Fortune, and the Hope theaters, among several others. Throughout his dealings with numerous playing companies, including Shakespeare's The Lord Chamberlain's Men that would go on to become the King's Men, Henslowe kept a diary about who he paid to perform, what productions were done, and even what props and costumes were used. The result is a fascinating tale of bits and pieces that give a real insider's look into the daily operations of what it meant to hire actors, collaborate across playing companies, and even part of how Henslowe was able to achieve a royal office in the court of James I as a theater owner in Shakespeare's lifetime. Since we do not have a similar diary of Shakespeare's dealings at the Globe, Henslowe's records help us see into the world of Shakespeare's theater to get an idea of what it was like to build dragons, stage the Battle of Shrewsbury, and where exactly the resources came from to pull off the grand feats of performance these theaters have gone down in history as having accomplished. Our guest this week, Amy Lidster, returns to the podcast for her second visit here at That Shakespeare Life to talk with us about Henslowe and his diaries. She recently presented on this topic at the Changing Histories Conference, which was held at Bush House of King's College, London in July of this year. In that presentation, Amy takes a look at the repertory of the Lord Strange's Men at the Rose Theatre in 1592 to 1593 to consider how casting practices may have encouraged interpretive links between plays dramatizing very different histories. Her ideas were discussed further as part of the Henslowe's Histories Conference workshop, which featured artistic director James Wallace. Dr. Amy Lidster is a postdoctoral research fellow at King's College London. She is working on the Leverhulme-funded project called Wartime Shakespeare, Fashioning Public Opinion Through Performance, which explores how Shakespeare's plays have been used to shape public opinion during periods of conflict between the 17th and 21st century. Most of Amy's other research concentrates on history plays, historiography, and the book trade. She has just finished her first book called Unruly Histories, Publishing the History Play in the Age of Shakespeare, and she is co-editing Edward III for the Internet Shakespeare Editions, and she recently co-organized with Kim Gilchrist a 2-day conference at King's called Changing Histories, Rethinking the Early Modern History Play. Amy, we are delighted to welcome you back to the podcast. It's good to speak with you again. Thank you for being here.
It's great to be back.
Ahead of the Changing Histories Conference, Amy published an article about Henslowe's histories in which she identifies Philip Henslowe and his diary as a source of great knowledge on the 16th century theater industry because Henslowe kept meticulous records on the company's repertory patterns and takings. For the Lord Strange's Men specifically, Amy, why is Henslowe so famous for his diary? Was he unique in keeping this kind of heavily detailed records, or did all theater owners keep diaries?
Well, Henslowe's diary is essentially an accounts book. And it features a range of different kinds of entries. And it's famous because it contains a wealth of information about the workings of theatres in London, especially between 1590 and 1604. It is actually somewhat unsystematic in its appearance and the kinds of entries it features. It does resemble other kinds of account books from the period, in that it mingles different types of entries. So Henslowe's diary contains mining records, which he actually didn't keep himself. Those were taken by his brother John before he inherited the diary.
Didn't he kind of reuse, I read somewhere that he reused a record book from a different industry that belonged to, I thought it was his father, but was it his brother?
Yeah, it was his brother John. And then, he then inherited that, and he used it for personal entries. So he records like recipes for healing diseases and, loans, personal loans involving him buying of properties. He also has pawn accounts in there because Henslowe worked as a pawnbroker. And then the majority of the entries, relate to theatrical matters, predominantly for the theatres in which he was invested. So the Rose and then later the Fortune. And it sheds light on a lot of the practices of companies that were using those stages. So the Admiral's Men is the company that's most associated with Henslowe and the Rose Theatre and later the Fortune Theatre. But Lord Stranger's Men, which was the company that I focused on in the article that you mentioned, and also several other different companies, Sussex's Men, the Queen's Men, the Chamberlain's Men, all appear in these records. And I think they're particularly important because there's no other similar theatrical record has survived from that period. It's very likely that other theatre owners and company sharers would have kept accounts. But one of the reasons why Henslowe's diary has survived was because it passed to his son-in-law, Edward Alleyn, who was a famous Elizabethan actor. Alleyn founded Dulwich College, and Henslowe's accounts became part of its archives or its library. So it's through that sort of process of transmission that these records have come down to us now and provide such valuable information.
In 1584, Henslowe purchased a property known as the Little Rose in Southwark, which contained actual rose gardens as the source for the name, but the building was almost certainly used as a brothel. Amy, once the Little Rose was transformed from a brothel in Southwark to the Rose Theatre we know it as today, was the establishment more respected, or was it still associated with being a brothel?
Well, so the Rose became the first purpose-built theatre on Bankside, and the environment in which it was built contained other forms of entertainment like bear baiting arenas and places for gaming and brothels, which was, of course, what the original site of the Rose was used for. And in some ways, at that time, theatre was not necessarily seen as being that different from these other forms of entertainment. Theatre didn't have a particularly refined reputation. It was often thought of as being quite a dangerous or dissolute place. And there were lots of complaints that were issued fairly regularly about the theatre, and there were attempts made to close it. And in these complaints, theatres are described alongside places like the bear baiting arenas and brothels, and the kinds of accusations that are levelled against them are that they're a breeding ground for insurrection and quarrelling, for lewd behaviour, licentious behaviour, for spreading diseases and spreading plague. So this is, in this particular time, there aren't necessarily sharp distinctions between these different forms. Of course, it should be pointed out that a lot of these complaints are written by detractors of the theatre, and there were many individuals who stood up for the virtues that seeing plays could afford. Thomas Heywood, in his Apology for Actors, which was published in 1612, so this is well over 20 years after the Rose was built, was still defending the theatre, showing that it's a place where people can go to see worthy acts performed. It's not a place for, fostering rebellion and inappropriate behavior.
I guess I have two clarifying questions about your answer here. First of all, because the Globe Theatre is often referred to as the first purpose-built theater. So but you said the Rose was the first purpose-built theater on Bankside. Are you making a distinction there, or is the Globe not the first purpose-built theater?
No, I think the Rose is the first purpose-built theatre. Yeah, in that particular area. I mean, it's there are theories that maybe Henslowe built the Rose unsure whether it would be a bear baiting arena or a theatre. It was only ever used as a theatre. But I mean, yeah, it is the first purpose-built theatre in that area.
And when you say that all of these things like bear baiting and the brothel are happening at the same time as the theater performances in the same building even, does that mean that people like Philip Henslowe and William Shakespeare at the moment in time when they are owning and running these theaters, are they sort of seen like a modern day Hugh Hefner in a sense of, running kind of successful, yes, but not necessarily the highest in respectability, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be quite a good comparison there. I mean, they are businessmen. Henslowe had a lot of interest in bear baiting. That's in fact where he made a lot of his fortune. And yes, these aren't at that time considered particularly respectful forms of entertainment, but they could make money.
Amy identifies Henslowe's diary as one way historians know about plays which were performed at the Rose Theatre, but no copy survives today, and many of these plays were history plays. Amy, since theaters in general had a rather shady reputation in the 16th century, were these representations of English history supposed to be farcical, or were they received as representations of real history?
I don't think they were intended to be farcical. It's obviously difficult to tell for lost plays because literally
because we can't read them. Yes,
we can't read them. It's possible that there were some farcical elements, perhaps. But I mean, to risk a generalization, I do think that staging history in the period often meant staging something quite serious. And in terms of real history, well, that would depend on the spectator, really. But, I mean, there's evidence to suggest that in the early modern period, history plays were thought of as part of the period's historical culture. So history itself was not a clearly defined discipline. And it's very possible that spectators would have gone to the theatre and not drawn a sharp distinction between a play about the past and a prose account about the past, a chronicle history like Holinshed's Chronicles. And they might have gone to the theatre to learn about their own national history, to learn about the histories of other countries and places in the world. This is actually a point that Ben Jonson pokes fun at in one of his plays called The Devil is an Ass. And he has, there's a character called Fitzdottrell who says that he's not cunning in the chronicle, meaning that he isn't knowledgeable about the material in chronicle histories. But he goes on to say, I confess I have it from the playbooks and think they are more authentic. So he gets his history from playbooks and thinks that they're more authentic. And Jonson here is satirizing this practice, but it also shows that this was quite a common pattern, that playgoers could go and see these representations of the past and to take them as accurate or representations of real history. But it was also something that made other people from the period a bit uneasy.
I think I can relate to that because oftentimes people will say, did you hear about this current event thing? I'll say, well, no, but I heard about it on the talk show, or I heard about it on the Tonight Show, or there's TV shows here where they all make fun of current events and political happenings in the US. And sometimes that's my only source of the news, which is often imperfect and partial. So I think I understand that joke very personally. So that's neat to me to see that Shakespeare had that same kind of thing happening in his life too. Shakespeare is famously partnered with James Burbage when they build the Globe Theatre, but did this impact Henslowe's association with Shakespeare? Did Shakespeare's plays get performed at the Rose by Lord Strange's men or later at the Fortune with the Admiral's men?
So for some of Shakespeare's earliest plays, it is likely that they were performed on the Rose stage. We can say quite confidently that the first part of Henry VI was performed by Lord Strange's men on the Rose Theatre in 1592. Similarly, Titus Andronicus was probably performed there by Sussex's men. And other plays like Richard III, we know that was performed before the Chamberlain's Men was founded, but it doesn't appear in Henslowe's records, and it's got uncertain theatrical origins. Possibly was performed by Pembroke's men, but that was therefore performed by someone somewhere in London. But by the time Shakespeare became established with the Chamberlain's Men, and he was one of the company's sharers, he works exclusively with that company for the rest of his professional life. And obviously they become the King's Men when James becomes king in 1603. So it doesn't really seem that Shakespeare had much of an ongoing working relationship with Henslowe. Most of his professional life was spent with the Burbages. So James Burbage, who built the theatre in 1576, and his son Richard, who was one of the leading actors of the Chamberlain's Men and the actor for whom Shakespeare wrote a lot of his leading roles. And Shakespeare was perhaps quite unusual in this way. You know, lots of other dramatists wrote for different companies and their plays would be performed on different stages. But Shakespeare did, once after those first few early years of his career, he was quite firmly tied to the Chamberlain's Men.
Henslowe's diary catalogs performances of plays that sound like Shakespeare performances, including a Hamlet, a Henry VI Part 1, a Henry V, Taming of the Shrew, and Titus Andronicus. But Henslowe records these productions without listing who's responsible for them. And the indication is that we don't know for sure if these are Shakespeare's performances, given that many of these records come from the brief period in time when the Admiral's men and the Lord Chamberlain's men joined forces in June of 1594 as a result of the playhouses being closed from plague. Amy, could these be records of Shakespeare's plays?
Some of them probably are, but some of them aren't. So, I mean, each record has to be kind of considered independently, and evidence from other sources has to be brought in. So for some of the plays that you mentioned, so Titus Andronicus, formed by the Admiral's Men and the Chamberlain's Men, probably is Shakespeare's play. We know it appears in the diary first being performed by Sussex's men in 1594. It was printed in 1594 with attributions to Derby's men, Sussex's men, and Pembroke's men. And then it appears again in the diary as being performed by the Admiral's men and the Chamberlain's men. So I think Titus is a really good example of Shakespeare's early working practices, because you get this sense of this is a play that is possibly moving around maybe between different companies. I mean, we can't necessarily trust the title page attribution, but that reference, I think, does indicate one of Shakespeare's plays. Hamlet is not Shakespeare's Hamlet. This one is likely what we often call an Hamlet, so an earlier version. We know this because we can quite comfortably date Shakespeare's Hamlet to about 1600. This other version that appears in the diary in 1594, there were earlier references to it as early as 1589, when Thomas Nash wrote a preface to Robert Greene's Menaphon. And in this, he's describing the theatrical offerings of London, and he's talking about a dramatist who will afford you whole Hamlets, I should say handfuls of tragical speeches. And so like Nash is being slightly critical or satirical in his description of this text. So there's maybe something slightly ridiculous about this Hamlet. Perhaps it's quite bombastic and features like quite, grand melodramatic speeches. So that is likely, it's likely that play that is cropping up in the diary and in this performance by the Admiral's men and the Chamberlain's men. Some of the other examples that you mentioned, Henry VI, yes, that was likely part one, performed by strangers' men in 1592. And Henry V, no, that probably wasn't. So we know that there was an earlier version, the famous victories of Henry V, performed by the Queen's men. There was another Henry V that was performed by the Admiral's men in 1596-95. And then we have Shakespeare's play, which again, we can kind of date quite exactly to round about 1599. So you can kind of see like the kinds of records that Henslowe keeps, they're not clear enough for us to make exact identifications only on the basis of those. It always involves bringing in lots of other evidence from other places.
It's interesting to me to realize that there are all of these Hamlets being written by multiple playwrights. Does that impact the theory that Shakespeare wrote his Hamlet based on a twist on the name of his son Hamnet? It seems more likely in context of Henslowe's diaries that Shakespeare was just operating within industry standards to have written his own Hamlet.
Yes, it does complicate all of these ideas, that all of these theories that want to connect Shakespeare's biography with his output, because in very much Shakespeare is a working dramatist who is responding most clearly, I think, to patterns in the wider theatrical repertories across the London stages. And there's a temptation to connect everything that he writes to his own inspiration, to events in his own life. But absolutely the case with Hamlet, yes, Shakespeare is drawing on existing sources. There's a previous play called Hamlet, and as you mentioned, with other plays as well, Shakespeare's Henry V draws significantly on the anonymous play The Famous Victories of Henry V. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet draws on a whole history of stories surrounding those figures. So the kind of the originality element of a lot of Shakespeare's plays, it needs to be questioned. It's not an assumption that we should have.
It's interesting that Shakespeare was not the first person to write Taming of the Shrew or to write the very first Titus Andronicus. Does that mean that while these were being performed on stage, if someone thought they were coming to see Henry V, did they know that this was going to be the same thing that they had seen before, or did they expect it to be different? What was that like for someone in the 1600s to go to the theater and see Shakespeare's Henry V?
Well, I guess it depends on how playing companies would have chosen to advertise their performances. I mean, we don't have any playbills that have survived from this period, so we don't exactly know, say, if Shakespeare's name was advertised on the playbills. He probably was once he became an established and known dramatist, which was really facilitated and probably sped up by the publication of his plays. So it's kind of unclear as to whether audience members would go along knowing that they were seeing a Shakespeare Henry V, and how that would differ from something they might have seen elsewhere. It's likely that theatre companies would try to advertise their work as being new or different or updated, but there is this sort of archival absence when it comes to knowing how theatre companies chose to market their new plays.
You mentioned earlier that Henslowe was father-in-law to Edward Alleyn, even leaving Alleyn shares of his theater in his will and obviously copies of this diary. Together, the men ran several theater venues, not just the Rose or the Fortune, but also separate bear baiting arenas. And their interest in both theater and bear baiting led the men to purchase the official office under James I to become keeper of the royal game, which meant that they managed the king's animals like bulls, bears, and mastiffs. Amy, why was it in the interest of an ambitious theater owner to want to manage the king's animals?
Well, I think they wanted this position because it was a lucrative and important position, and it was one that Henslowe had sought out for a while. And it fits so well with Henslowe and Elaine's business interests. Elaine had bought Bear Garden, which was a bear baiting arena very close to the Rose. And Henslowe had run this. He started running it about 1594. Unfortunately, not a lot of information survives in terms of their bear baiting interests and the running of Bear Garden. And after, when the lease on the Rose Theatre expired in about 1605, they pulled down the Rose. And from that point onwards, Henslowe mainly focused on his work as a master of the bears at Bear Garden. And it was through that he and Elaine made a small fortune. And again, later on, Henslowe built the Hope Theatre, which was it did have a dual purpose as being a bear baiting arena and a stage for actors. So these interests were sort of an integral part of Henslowe and Elaine's business life. And so this was a position that they sought.
One record from Henslowe's diary that I found particularly fascinating, in fact, I think it's my favorite so far, is a dragon for Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus production. Amy, why did he need a dragon? And then why was Henslowe keeping records for the props in Marlowe's plays?
Yeah, so the dragon is part of an inventory of all the props held by the Admiral's men. It was taken in March 1598. And yeah, Henslowe lists this is a very brief and frustratingly brief entry that just reads, "one dragon in Faustus." And critics have debated where this dragon appears. And it definitely seems likely that it was a disguise for Mephistopheles, who is the demon that appears regularly to Faustus throughout the play. In one of the texts from Faustus that survives, Faustus has this Latin invocation where he's calling upon the devil and calling upon a spirit. And in the midst of this Latin invocation, there's an English word, dragon, and that's puzzled many critics. And it seems perhaps to be a misplaced stage direction. And it seems likely that was describing perhaps the appearance of Mephistopheles when he first comes on the stage, and that's kind of supported later in the couple of lines later where Faustus says to him, "Can you come back in some more pleasing shape?" And he returns in the disguise of a friar. So that's likely the part in the play where this prop was needed. In terms of what the prop looked like, it's up for critics to kind of debate and hypothesize on that. We don't really have any further details. It's possible that people might have constructed it. There are many forms in which it could have taken. And in terms of why Henslowe was keeping these records, particularly in the mid to late 1590s, he seems to have worked as a banker or a manager for the Admiral's men in particular. And through his diary, he records payments, lending money to buy costumes, to buy props, to make various different things. And it's part of his work as this kind of manager that he is gathering this information. One of the other props that appears in that same inventory, which particularly interests me and which we featured, or in fact we did not feature in the workshop at the conference, was a cauldron. It reads "one cauldron for the Jew," which unambiguously in this case refers to the Jew of Malta, another of Marlowe's plays. And in this play, the Jew of Malta dies in the cauldron at the end. And in the same week, this play was performed on the Rose stage in 1592 by Lord Strange's men. And at a similar time, just a few days apart, there was another play. This one is now lost. It's called Bindo and Ricardo. And it's likely that this play was based on a novel called one of the novellas in William Paynter's The Palace of Pleasure, which features one of the central characters dying in a cauldron. So it's an interesting example of quite a striking and perhaps unusual prop being used to stage the exact same kind of death, just a few days apart on the same stage, which we kind of used in the workshop to explore ideas about what the reappearance of striking props like that might suggest and the connections they might suggest between different plays.
We talk of Burbage always playing major roles, and Robert Armin or Will Kemp are the traditional Feste characters, but how did playing companies cast their roles? Does Henslowe's diary indicate the hiring process or figuring out which actor was going to play which character?
I mean, it sheds some light on the hiring of actors. Henslowe sometimes develops he contracts actors to work for his companies, meaning that they can't at that point, work for another company. In terms of providing detailed casting lists, those don't appear. We have some evidence from surviving playhouse plots, from reports of the kinds of roles that, say, Henslowe's leading actor, Alain, the kinds of roles he regularly played. So it's kind of building an understanding of casting practices through those methods. So yes, typecasting was one of the main ways in which repertory companies from the period cast their plays. So you would have the leading actors like Richard Burbage from the Chamberlain's Men and Edward Alain from the Admiral's Men taking those main roles. You would have various clowns taking on the clowning parts. And it's important, I think, also to think that not only did typecasting affect how companies cast their plays, but it also would affect how dramatists would write their plays, because they would write according to the types that they knew they had. And again, drawing on the workshop that we ran at the Changing Histories conference, one of the things we looked at was the impact of typecasting and how these practices, similar to the example I gave with the prop, how these practices encourage connections between different plays. So in terms of history play criticism, which was the focus of the conference, there's a tendency to focus only on English histories. But we drew on a week in the life of the Rose Theatre and staged scenes from several different plays, all performed, almost consecutively, that staged English history in the first part of Henry VI, relatively recent history in the Battle of Alcazar, which is a historical battle from 1578, biblical history in a looking glass for London and England, and history about the fall of Jerusalem, which is likely the subject of the lost play Titus and Vespasian. And what we found was that by having the same group of actors performing these plays one after the other, it did seem to break down the national boundaries between these different kinds of histories. And it sort of gave us a different way of imagining the experiences of early modern audiences.
So when you're saying that dramatists, when they were writing the play, are operating off of industry standard of typecasting in certain roles, as well as the records indicating that very specific props were used by one playing company over here and then another playing company over there, does that mean that both actors and resources among the various playing companies of London were being shared? Was there an overlap between the best actors' stories and props, especially since you mentioned Henslowe had a contractual relationship with his actors? Were they contractually obligated to not do that?
Well, it would vary again. So sometimes Henslowe did issue contracts with actors, meaning that, yes, they couldn't play elsewhere. They were committed to playing with Henslowe for a specified period of time. Shakespeare is another example of someone who wrote and acted, exclusively with the Chamberlain's Men and the King's Men once he was established there. But then, on the other hand, other actors and dramatists moved around. We know that Johnson wrote for the King's Men. He also wrote for boys' companies. Thomas Haywood wrote and for different companies as well. Other actors would have moved around. It was fine for actors to move around, but perhaps it seems more common for the more established actors to find a semi-permanent home for themselves somewhere, and then occasionally they would move somewhere else. Edward Alleyn performed with Stranger's Men, then he performed with the Admiral's Men. So there's some degree of sharing, but then there are also contracts and carefully carved out properties in many ways, literally the properties that are used by a company, and also things like plays as being something that a company or certain individuals own, and not something that was shared or performed by another company the next day. The plays were sort of licensed to specific companies, and companies would get very upset. There are a few examples of that if one of their plays was performed by a different company.
Does that make it kind of a status thing for an actor to achieve this semi-permanent status at a playing company, in a way that they're traveling around to different companies to make money as an actor, but then once they're good at it or they're famous, like someone like Burbage, to be, no, you can only work, here? Was that an accomplishment?
Yes, I suppose it could be considered an accomplishment. I think it would probably bring some security to a particular actor to have a regular home and to be associated with a particular theatre. It would assist. It would probably help them in getting good roles as well, because writers would often write with particular actors in mind. So if you were a leading actor firmly associated with a particular company, a dramatist would possibly be writing parts with you in mind, rather than if you were moving around different companies all the time. Someone like Richard Burbage, he was a shareholder in the Chamberlain's Men, so he wasn't sort of bound to it in the sense that by contract, and he was forbidden to go elsewhere. It was part of it. It worked for him. It was his investment in the company, and the receiving regular takings from the theatre that would motivate the fact that he works exclusively with that company.
Exploring the inside of a 16th century playhouse and all of its ins and outs about how it runs and the props and the actors is a fascinating topic, and I know we would love to explore this further. What are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend that we use to learn more?
Well, there are a lot. To give you a few examples, seeing as we've been talking about Henslowe and Alleyn, I would strongly recommend the Henslowe Alleyn Digitization Project, which is an open access resource that has images of all of the diary and many other Henslowe Alleyn papers. There are short essays and articles on there about the runnings of the theatre and about business transactions involving Henslowe and Alleyn. So that's a really good resource about the London theatre. For lost plays, the Lost Plays database, again, open access, a wonderful resource for finding out about the lost plays and how much we know about their content. The database usually always begins with the entries from Henslowe's diary, so you can see exactly when these plays were performed and who possibly staged them. The Henslowe's diary itself is a really interesting resource for flicking through. R.A. Folks's edition is the most recent, but you can generally find an open access, a freely available one by W.W. Gregg online. And to give an example of a critical study about a playing company, I've mentioned Lord Stranger's Men, and there's a great relatively recent book on Lord Stranger's Men by Lawrence Manley and Sally Beth MacLean, which is fascinating for exploring how much we know about the troupe, the repertory they had, patterns in their repertory, and where they performed, which is a great resource.
Those are excellent resources, and we'll link to all of these in the show notes for today's episode. Now, Amy, you know this from your visit last time, but we will give you another round at your desert island book question, because we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so this choice would be in addition to those.
Okay, so I will choose something different from my Anatomy of Melancholy, which I think I chose last time.
Yes, and so different deserted island, you get a new book choice.
Okay. Well, I'll slightly keep with the early modern theme and go for George Chapman's works of Homer, basically. So his English translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which would be very helpful because they're long. So this is going to keep me going for a long time. And also, I think they would be quite suited for this hypothetical desert island because, I mean, the kinds of themes that are explored, especially in the Odyssey, about this pursuit of home and a desire to travel home. I don't know whether I'd be striving to get home from this desert island or not, but I think that would be quite relevant.
You'll be well established. You might just want to stay. Yes.
Yes.
So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I've just finished the first full manuscript of my first book, so I'm very glad to have that off my desk and be on to new projects now.
That is very exciting. Is that available now? Has that been published?
No, it's not available now. It begins its very long route to publication, but I'll let you know when it.
Please do. Yeah, we'll look forward to that. Congratulations.
Thank you. So I'm currently working on a project called Wartime Shakespeare at King's College London, which is about how Shakespeare's plays have been used to shape public opinion during periods of conflict. So that's one of my main projects, which will involve a book and an edited collection and an exhibition in London.
Lots of Churchill in your future.
Yes, there will be some Churchill.
That's very fascinating. Well, Amy Lidster, we will definitely look forward to your upcoming projects. Very excited about your forthcoming book. We'll look forward to seeing that. And I appreciate you stopping by today and helping us take a look inside the operations of 16th century theater. This has been delightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To add your voice to the conversation about the daily operations of theater companies and 16th century playhouses, be sure to check out today's show notes. Show notes are the accompanying blog article that goes along with each episode, and it's where I keep bonus history content with images, maps, links, and the resources Amy recommends today for you to learn more about 16th century playhouses and Philip Henslowe. So come step behind the curtain with us and access all this history at CassidyCash.com/episode 86. That's CassidyCash.com/EP86. When I first started studying Shakespeare, especially as an American, where the English language is very different on this side of the pond than where Shakespeare was writing, I often mispronounced some of the words that you find in the plays. Like originally I said Gloucester instead of Gloucester. Well, that's why I downloaded Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app. It's an easy-to-use, straightforward app that you can download to your phone or tablet on iTunes as well as Google Play. And it lets you search any word from Shakespeare, and then it tells you exactly how to say it with a playable audio guide built right in. Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app is like having a professional voice coach that you can carry in your pocket. Explore all the features of this app and download it right now at CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next Monday. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.